I remember the sound first, not the wind cutting through the ravine, not the faint rattle of loose stones under my boots, but the deep, trembling hum rising from beneath the ground. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't organic. It felt intentional, as if the earth itself were exhaling after holding its breath for too long. That was the moment I knew the site wasn't just old, it was wrong. A place that had waited centuries for someone foolish enough, or desperate enough, to listen. For decades, the region had been sealed off by a mix of politics, superstition, and something no one ever wrote down officially. Government documents arrived with missing pages. Archaeologists who attempted to study the area left reports that ended mid-sentence. An entire team vanished in the 1980s, and still, the territory remained untouched. Like a terminal patient everyone preferred to ignore. But now, with my special authorization, with the permissions that took me years to obtain, and with the stubbornness that never quite leaves me, I was finally crossing the border into it. The air there had a weight of its own, cold, dry, as if time had stopped and refused to move forward. The sun barely reached the valley, creating shadows far too long for the morning hour. I walked slowly, every step echoing as if I were being watched. And maybe I was. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Places like that hold stories that don't want to be touched. My local guide stopped several meters behind me, refusing to advance. "Dr. Montoya, the ground here remembers," he said, without looking at me. It was the same phrase I had heard repeatedly throughout the week. The same phrase whispered by people who trembled just mentioning that area on the map. I didn't believe in legends, but I believed in patterns. And collective fear is always an interesting pattern. I continued alone. The vegetation thinned as I approached a raised formation in the rock. It wasn't quite a mountain, more like a geological scar, a rupture in the ground that looked as if it had been made from the inside out. Every grain of dust seemed older than it should be, heavier, more intentional, as if the soil had witnessed something that predated everything we know as civilization. When I reached the top of the fissure, something caught my eye, a very faint metallic glimmer, almost impossible to notice beneath the layer of sediment. It wasn't gold, it wasn't silver, it wasn't bronze. It had a color that defied description, the color of something that shouldn't be there. I knelt down, felt the ground vibrating ever so slightly, and when I brushed the surface of the sand, it moved on its own, revealing perfectly geometric lines carved into the stone. It wasn't natural, and it was definitely not human. My heartbeat quickened, but my mind stayed cold. The two parts of me have always worked that way. While fear pushes, curiosity pulls. That old duality between wanting to step back and needing to know. The geometry was complex but subtle, 3 concentric circles, connected by equidistant straight lines. That made no sense in any known artistic style. There was something mathematical about it, something operating on logic far more advanced than any culture that should have existed at that time. But what struck me even more was not the precision, it was the erosion. The markings suggested thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years of wear. But that wasn't possible. Civilizations capable of advanced geometry simply did not exist at that time. At least not officially. I leaned closer, tracing the grooves with my fingertips. The material looked like stone, but the density was wrong. It vibrated subtly, as if it had a memory of its own. A faint electrical impulse ran across my fingers, light, almost cordial, as if the artifact were recognizing contact. I took a slow breath. The thought was too absurd to speak aloud, and yet, in that moment, I knew this wasn't a structure. It was an entrance, a seal, an invitation, or perhaps a warning. I set my flashlight on the ground and began clearing the remaining dust. The more I uncovered, the more I realized the pattern extended far beyond what I expected, spanning meters, forming a complex matrix of symbols that repeated with small variations. It was like observing the DNA of an idea, encoded in stone. My radio crackled. My guide spoke, his voice shaking. "Doctor, I shouldn't be here. Not on this land. Not with what you're waking up." I turned the radio off. The truth is, I was beginning to feel something too. Not fear, but anticipation. The feeling of standing before something that could dismantle everything we believed about human evolution, our chronology, our scientific arrogance. And at that exact moment, precisely when I cleared the final layer of dust, the entire pattern pulsed. It wasn't light. It was vibration. As if a deep frequency buried beneath kilometers of rock had activated after centuries. The sound traveled through the soil, climbed into my hands, and resonated in my chest. And then, with the same subtlety with which it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was not natural. It was the kind of silence that watches, the kind that waits. I stood slowly, trying to process what I had just felt. Something down there had responded to my touch. Something dormant. Something far older than our history and far more advanced than anything we could explain. There, at the edge of that fissure, facing that impossible matrix carved into stone, I felt that my entire life had led me to this exact second, and I still didn't know that the artifact was far closer than I imagined. If this story is grabbing you, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. The descent into the fissure was not part of my original plan. I had intended only to survey the surface markings, record initial impressions, and return with a specialized team. But plans have a way of dissolving when confronted with the impossible, and the impossible was staring back at me from the stone floor, silent, ancient, and undeniably deliberate. The vibration I had felt still lingered faintly in my bones, like an echo of a sound too deep for human ears. My instinct told me to retreat, but my training, my entire life's work, demanded the opposite. I secured a rope to a stable outcrop and leaned over the edge. The darkness beneath me seemed unnatural, dense, as if light itself were hesitant to enter. My flashlight cut only a narrow cone into the void, revealing the top of a vertical shaft that extended farther than the beam reached. It didn't look geological. The walls were too smooth, too symmetrical, too intentional. As I began to lower myself, the temperature dropped sharply. The air became cold and dry, as though untouched for millennia. Dust rose with each movement of the rope, catching the beam of my light in suspended clouds. With every meter descended, I felt the presence of the structure around me, a silent architecture that had waited centuries for someone to return. 30 meters down, my boots finally touched solid ground. The chamber I entered was far larger than the opening above suggested. The ceiling arched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness. The walls curved in subtle, mathematically precise arcs, reflecting the same geometric intelligence as the markings above. This was not a natural cavern. It was a construction, a chamber, and judging by the thin layer of untouched sediment, I was the first person to set foot here in an age beyond comprehension. The flashlight flickered. At first, I assumed it was interference from the descent battery strain or dust infiltration, but then the beam stabilized again, and I noticed something strange on the far wall. Lines, dozens of them, faint and sharp, running horizontally like inscriptions. I approached slowly, each step echoing across the chamber, the sound bouncing back in a distorted way that made it feel like someone or something was listening. When I reached the wall, I realized the inscriptions were not written or carved. They were etched with a precision that bordered on technological, each line perfectly parallel, the depths uniform, the spacing exact. It reminded me of spectrographic frequency lines, or coded data. But encoded in stone? That would make no sense. Unless I stepped back to examine the larger pattern. The lines converged at several points, forming clusters, like nodes, or coordinates. There was structure in the arrangement. Memory, information. And then, as I moved my hand over the surface, the chamber responded. A low hum began not from the walls, but from beneath the floor. A deep resonance, subtle at first, then growing, pulsing in a steady rhythm. My flashlight vibrated faintly in my grip. I took a step back, instinctively bracing myself. Then the wall lit up, not with light in the conventional sense. It was more like the surface became reflective, revealing layers beneath the stone, shapes hidden within the material itself. Patterns emerged like constellations aligning. The lines were no longer passive etchings. They were pathways, like circuits, a map, or perhaps a memory interface. I forced myself to remain calm. I recorded every detail in my notebook, my hand steady despite the tremor in the chamber's air. I ran hypotheses through my mind: piezoelectric compounds, mineral reactions to pressure, natural resonance patterns. But none of these could explain the coordination. None could explain the feeling that the structure was not reacting randomly, it was reacting to me. My radio hissed again. This time, the voice that came through was not my guide. Oyadoi here. I froze. Static consumed the channel, punctuated by faint distortion. The voice returned, warped, layered with what sounded like echoes. But the word here repeated unmistakably, not spoken, more like imitated. I turned the radio off. I couldn't allow external fear, real or imagined, to dictate my actions. Not when I was standing inside the most important archaeological discovery of the century. Perhaps of any century. My flashlight passed across the far end of the chamber, revealing a second structure, a raised platform, square, slightly elevated from the floor. But what drew my attention was what rested at its center, a stone object, roughly circular, half buried in sediment. But the texture was unmistakable, the same impossible alloy I had seen above, the same faint metallic sheen. I approached with care, brushing away centuries of dust. The object was large, about the size of a human torso. The surface was smooth, almost polished, but interrupted by thin grooves that spiraled inward. It looked like a lid, or a seal. The realization struck me. This chamber was not a tomb. It was a containment structure, and this object was its focus. My heart beat faster, not with fear, but with a profound, electric anticipation. If this object predated human civilization, if it truly belonged to a technological culture lost to time, then everything our timelines, our theories of development, our understanding of what humanity is would be rewritten. My hand hovered above the object. I hesitated. Then I touched it. The chamber exhaled. The vibration rose like a living heartbeat, the grooves in the object glowing faintly with the same subtle, undefined luminance I had seen in the markings above. Not bright, not artificial, more like a memory waking up, unsure of whether it should open its eyes. The platform beneath the object shifted, barely perceptible, but enough to release a thin crack of ancient dust. Something mechanical was embedded deep within. The stone. My mind raced. This wasn't ceremonial. This was engineered, and it was reactivating. I stepped back carefully, my breaths controlled, calculating escape routes, structural integrity, potential for collapse, but nothing collapsed, nothing attacked, nothing cracked open. Instead, the object pulsed once, then again. Then the entire chamber returned to silence, as if it had tested my presence, acknowledged it, and then waited. I stared at the artifact, realizing that whatever intelligence had constructed this place had just recognized me, not as a threat, but as a key. And above the chamber, far beyond the rock and dust, I knew the surface markings had also changed. They were no longer dormant symbols, they were instructions, and I had just activated the first step.